Marcus Cole stood in the rain-slicked lobby of Sterling Tower holding a bouquet of crimson roses, his worn coat dripping onto the marble floor, while the CEO's security team closed in. But when the ivory envelope slipped from the ribbon, the expression on Violet Sterling's face shifted from cold dismissal to something far more dangerous. Recognition of a handwriting she thought she'd never see again. The alarm on Marcus Cole's phone vibrated at 5:15, just like every other morning. He killed it before the second chime, swung his legs off the worn sofa that served as his bed, and stood in the pre-dawn stillness, listening for any sound from the bedroom down the hall. Nothing but soft breathing. His son, Elijah, was still asleep. He had another hour. Marcus shuffled to the kitchen and started the ancient coffee maker, its sputtering hiss the only sound in the cramped apartment. While the coffee brewed, he pulled the envelope taped inside the cabinet door and counted what remained, $43. Rent was due Friday. Today was Tuesday. He'd already picked up an extra shift at the flower shop this week and was scheduled for another Thursday morning. But Thursday felt like a lifetime away when you were holding $43 and thinking about Friday's deadline. He pushed the envelope back, its hiding place a secret he shared with no one. Elijah would need breakfast soon. Marcus prepared Elijah's meal, scrambled eggs, toast, and the last of the orange juice stretched thin with tap water. The boy never noticed, and Marcus had long since stopped letting guilt gnaw at him. Elijah ate without complaint, always remembering to say thank you. That simple courtesy made Marcus feel like he was doing something right, even on mornings when his bank account seemed to mock him. The phone rang at 6:42 as Marcus was pulling on his second sock. It was Denise from Petals and Bloom, the flower shop 3 blocks over where Marcus worked part-time. She sounded apologetic, her voice hoarse from what was probably another late night. Thomas had called in sick with the flu. She needed someone to handle the Sterling Group delivery before 9 o'clock sharp. It was a prepaid order, in their system for years, with special instructions. The client who placed it had passed away the previous year, but his attorney had arranged for the delivery on a timer, set to go out today. Marcus glanced at the clock, then at the closed door behind which Elijah was still sleeping. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had a doctor's appointment at 10, but she was home now and owed him one from the time he'd replaced her kitchen faucet without asking for payment. He knocked on her door at 6:50. She agreed to watch Elijah for the morning, shooing him out the door with reassurances that the boy would be just fine. Denise was specific about one thing: the card had to reach the CEO directly. Not an assistant, not a receptionist, the CEO herself. The attorney had been insistent: whatever you do, don't lose the card. Marcus jotted the address on a scrap of paper and headed for the shop. When he saw the arrangement waiting in the cooler, he understood why Denise had been anxious. This wasn't like the standard bouquets they handled at Petals and Bloom. Most were grocery store rows of color, cellophane-wrapped and predictable. This was something else entirely. Deep crimson roses, densely clustered, their petals like crushed velvet against the morning light. They'd been arranged by someone with an artist's eye, tied with a black ribbon knotted twice, not once. At the center of the ribbon, tucked rather than attached, was a small ivory envelope sealed with silver wax, pressed into a shield-shaped emblem Marcus didn't recognize. When he lifted the arrangement, it felt heavier than it looked, dense with intention and history he couldn't begin to guess at. He held it carefully, the way he once held calibration reports at his former job, documents where a single misinterpreted line could cost someone dearly. He stepped outside into the rain, one arm curved protectively around the bouquet to keep it dry. The Sterling Group lobby was designed to make visitors feel insignificant, marble floors stretching endlessly, 2 stories of glass, potted trees that looked more expensive than most people's apartments. The reception desk was a curved slab of pale stone staffed by 2 women in matching navy blazers who had perfected the art of polite dismissal. Marcus pushed through the revolving door at 8:41, pausing just inside to shake the rain off his jacket with one hand. The other held the roses. The woman at the desk looked up. Her eyes landed on his face first, then drifted to his jacket, his shoes, the flowers he carried. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle realignment that Marcus had seen many times in many different lobbies. "Can I help you?" "Delivery for Violet Sterling," Marcus said. "Prepaid order from Petals and Bloom. Deliveries go to the mailroom on the second floor. I have specific instructions that this goes to Ms. Sterling directly. Personal item, not a standard order." The receptionist exchanged a glance with her colleague, a look Marcus recognized all too well, the assessment that had been made before he'd finished his sentence. Robert Vance appeared from the corridor to the left, head of building security, broad-shouldered and watchful. "Sir," he said, "not quite a question. Do you have a scheduled delivery slot?" "No, I was told this is time-sensitive and needs to reach the CEO before 9. A cluster of men in expensive suits crossed the lobby without glancing in Marcus's direction. The revolving door turned behind him. A man in a cashmere coat swept through, greeted by name, and proceeded directly to the elevator without pausing. Marcus held his ground, the flowers cradled in his arms. One receptionist leaned toward the other and whispered something. The word audacious drifted just far enough to reach him. Then, quieter but not quite quiet enough, these people always try. The elevator opened. 3 people emerged. Sarah Mitchell moving quickly with a tablet, Daniel Foster in a charcoal suit, and Violet Sterling half a step ahead of both. She saw the roses first, deep red against the gray marble, then the black ribbon, then the ivory envelope. She kept walking. "Take it to the mailroom." Marcus stepped forward. "Ms. Sterling, I was asked to deliver this to you personally. The card should be read before. I don't accept flower deliveries." Her voice was final. Daniel Foster glanced at Marcus with faint amusement. "I know her time is valuable," Marcus continued, still addressing Violet. "But the person who arranged this delivery is someone you knew. The instructions were specific and set up more than a year in advance." Violet turned back. For the first time, she really looked at him. "Robert," she said quietly. Robert stepped forward and placed a hand on Marcus's arm, firmly enough that the bouquet shifted. The ivory envelope slipped from the black ribbon, turned once in the air, and landed face up on the marble floor. The silver wax seal caught the lobby light, a shield shape pressed deep and precise. Violet's face went still. She knew that seal. She had seen it on every piece of correspondence her father had sent his attorney, on every personal letter she'd found in his desk after he was gone. It was Charles Sterling's seal. "Stop," she said. Robert let go of Marcus's arm. The lobby had gone quietly alert, the way rooms do when the person in charge changes tone suddenly. Violet walked to where the envelope lay on the marble. She bent down and picked it up herself. Her hands were steady when she opened it. She broke the silver seal cleanly, peeled back the flap, and unfolded the single sheet inside. She read it without making a sound. Then she read it again. The lobby was silent enough that the rain on the glass was audible. Daniel Foster said, in the tone of someone being reasonable, "It could be a forgery. People research executives, find signatures. It's not a forgery." Violet's voice was quiet, but weighted. "I know my father's handwriting." The note was brief. It read, "Violet, if you're still angry with me, save that anger for later. Trust the man who carries these flowers." She folded the paper and pressed it against her palm. Marcus watched her face and said nothing. He hadn't known what the card said. He'd taken the job because Denise needed someone, and he needed the hours. Because the alternative was sitting at home, counting $43. He looked at the CEO of Sterling Group, holding a note from her deceased father. And he sensed something vast happening around him, something whose shape he couldn't yet grasp. "Who are you?" Violet asked. "My name is Marcus Cole. I work part-time at Petals and Bloom. I was asked to make this delivery." "Do you know why my father chose you?" "I didn't know he was your father." She studied him for a long moment. "That's not an answer. I met a man about 3 years ago," Marcus said carefully. "I helped him when his car broke down on a rainy night. He was kind to me afterward. I didn't know his name at the time, and I didn't learn it after. That's the honest extent of what I know. Violet looked at Marcus differently now. She wasn't evaluating his jacket, or his shoes, or anything superficial. She was studying the steadiness in his face, the way he held himself without apology or pleading, or any performance of humility or defiance. She saw a man who had walked into a building that didn't want him, and had stayed because he'd been asked to do a simple thing and intended to do it. Something in that steadiness unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was the exact quality she'd spent 14 months searching for in every advisor, consultant, and board member who sat across from her. And here it stood in her lobby in a wet jacket, holding red roses. "Sarah," she said, "please take Mr. Cole somewhere he can wait comfortably, not the main lobby." She looked at Marcus. "I'd like to talk with you before you leave." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Sarah stepped forward and gestured toward the elevator. Marcus nodded once, gathered the roses more securely, and followed her. As he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the two receptionists on his back. He didn't turn around. He'd learned long ago that turning around only gave people what they wanted, confirmation that he knew where he stood. The small waiting area Sarah led him to was on the 4th floor. Good chairs, a side table with coffee and water, a view of the city in the rain. Sarah poured him a cup without asking, a small kindness that told Marcus she'd understood something about the morning that the people downstairs hadn't. He sat, held the coffee, and watched the rain stream down the glass. He thought about Elijah at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, probably on her couch with his toy truck, watching cartoons and causing no trouble at all. Violet arrived 20 minutes later. She sat across from Marcus and placed the folded note on the table between them. "Tell me about the night you met my father," she said. Marcus paused, remembering. The rain. The terror. Because Elijah had a fever of 103. And he'd been driving to urgent care when he saw the car angled against the curb on Willow Road, hazard lights blinking. The older man inside, gray-haired, well-dressed, had gotten out to check the front of the car, and was standing in the rain without a coat. The car had hit the curb hard enough to blow a tire and trigger something in the engine, but the man was unhurt. What he was shaken, badly shaken in the quiet way older people sometimes are. The way that looks like calm but isn't. Marcus had pulled over. He didn't particularly want to. His son was sick, he was behind schedule, and the rain was coming down sideways. But he pulled over anyway. He called roadside assistance, helped the man back into the car out of the rain, then gave the man his own jacket, because the car was too cold to warm up quickly. He sat in his own car with Elijah in the back seat, his arm around his son, and watched through the windshield until the tow truck arrived. When the tow truck came, he helped the driver connect the car and guided traffic around the scene until things were moving again. The man had gripped his hand before leaving, held it with both of his, and said, without explaining what he meant, "One day, what you are will come back to you." Violet listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked something unexpected. "What did you do before the flower shop?" "Operations engineering," Marcus said. "I analyzed route efficiency for a mid-sized freight company called Horizon Freight Solutions. I worked there about 5 years." "Why did you leave?" "I was asked to approve a performance summary I knew was inaccurate. It overstated the efficiency of a cold chain route by a significant margin. I refused. Things became uncomfortable. I left." Violet's expression sharpened, more focused now. Horizon Freight Solutions is a subcontractor on several routes through the Mid-Atlantic corridor. Marcus paused. "Some of those routes run through your network." The silence in the room shifted. Sarah knocked once and opened the door without waiting. "I found a filed report from 3 years ago," she said quietly. "It's in the archived compliance records. There's a name on the refusal signature." Violet already knew what that name would be. "The report flagged a structural gap in our cold chain network," Sarah continued. "At the time, we would have caught approximately 14 months of fraudulent cost allocation before it compounded." She paused. "The report was buried." "By whom?" Violet asked. Sarah glanced toward the door. "By the same person who's been presenting solvency projections to the board." The board meeting convened at 11 in the main conference room on the 36th floor. 12 people around the long table, most older than Violet. All white, all looking at the prepared presentation on the screen with the concentrated attention people give when they've been told the situation is urgent. Daniel Foster stood at the front, speaking with the unhurried assurance of someone who'd rehearsed many times. He laid out the numbers in careful sequence: root losses, margin compression, debt service costs, supply chain disruption penalties. He built the case slowly, like a house with only one door, and that door led to a partial sale of operational control to a group called Arcturus Capital Partners. Board members were nodding before he finished. That was the thing about numbers delivered by someone confident and well-dressed. They tended to produce a hypnotic agreement that had less to do with truth than with presentation. Violet let him finish, gave no outward sign that his presentation was anything other than thorough. Then she said, "I'd like to bring someone in." Daniel looked at her. "The decision timeline. I know the timeline. I'm asking for 15 minutes. She didn't phrase it as a question. Marcus entered in his damp jacket. 12 board members looked at him the way people look at something that doesn't belong. Their eyes moved across his face, his wrists without a watch, the seams of his jacket, the absence of briefcase or badge. One board member near the far end shifted his water glass aside, as if clearing space between himself and whatever was about to happen. Another folded his arms. A woman 2 seats down looked at Violet with an expression that silently questioned her seriousness. Daniel Foster said pleasantly, "Are we having the florist weigh in on our financial structure?" Nobody laughed, but nobody objected either. Marcus didn't respond to Daniel. He looked at the screen. The data there was familiar, not because he'd studied it, but because he'd traveled these numbers so many times they'd become part of how he moved through the world. He recognized the root codes, the timeline, the particular structure of falsification he'd last seen 3 years ago on a spreadsheet that had cost him his career. "The loss categories in columns 8 through 11, Marcus said, his voice steady and unhurried, "are all routed through the same third-party carrier. That carrier doesn't own enough rolling stock to run those routes at the volume shown." A board member with silver hair, Margaret Ashby, leaned forward. "How do you know that?" "Because I worked in this network. I know what those carriers can and can't move. The volumes on that screen are physically impossible, given the fleet size that carrier operated in those years." The room went very quiet. Daniel's smile remained, but it had shifted, the way a mask shifts when the face beneath it changes. Margaret Ashby looked at the screen, then at Marcus, then at the screen again. She'd been on this board for 11 years, and had never seen anyone walk in uninvited and make the air feel different. Daniel Foster spoke smoothly, saying the analysis was interesting but came from someone without standing, without current credentials, without access to verified records. He said it the way people in expensive suits say things about people in damp jackets, with the confidence that comes from knowing the room is already on your side. He looked at the board members as he spoke, not at Marcus. "You don't have access to current records," Daniel said. "I'm not talking about current," Marcus replied, his voice calm, the kind of calm that comes from having said this exact thing before to people who didn't want to hear it, and having paid the price, and saying it anyway. "I'm talking about the dates on your own report." He walked closer to the screen. Several board members shifted in their chairs, the unconscious adjustment people make when someone they dismissed begins to occupy more space than expected. March through August, 3 years ago. During that window, this carrier would have needed 3 times its actual capacity to run the routes being billed. But the invoices were paid, which means either the carrier had assets it never registered, which someone would have caught, or the costs were fabricated and assigned to these routes to look like operating losses. He paused, not performing, simply laying facts on the table like boards. "I know this because I filed a report that said exactly this 3 years ago, and that report disappeared." Daniel began to respond, his voice still carrying the measured patience of a man explaining something to someone beneath him. But Violet spoke first. "I have the camera logs," she said. The room shifted. Sarah connected her tablet to the room's display system. The screen split. On one side, the billing records Daniel had presented; on the other, warehouse exit logs from a regional distribution center. On the dates corresponding to the largest invoices, the logs showed 0 outbound movement. The trucks hadn't moved, but the costs had been recorded. The silence that followed had weight and texture. It wasn't confusion. It was people rearranging everything they thought they knew. Margaret Ashby said quietly, "Pull up the carrier's registration and fleet records." Daniel stood at the front of the room, very still. His hands, which had been gesturing with easy confidence moments before, hung at his sides. The color hadn't left his face, but something behind it had shifted. An older board member who'd looked at Marcus with suspicion when he entered now turned to look at him with entirely different eyes. Not an apology, not yet, but an acknowledgement that something he'd been certain of moments ago was no longer certain. Margaret Ashby turned to Violet. "How long have you known about this?" "Since this morning," Violet said. "Since a man I tried to have removed from my lobby showed me something I should have seen a long time ago." The weight of that sentence settled over the table. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The older board member who'd folded his arms when Marcus walked in now unfolded them and placed both hands flat on the table, the way a man does when the ground beneath him shifts. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time his gaze didn't contain judgment. It contained the uncomfortable recognition of a man who decided in the space between breaths that the person walking in didn't matter, and he'd been wrong. Not just about the data, about the man. Then Margaret said, "I want to see the full compliance file." Grace Whitman arrived within the hour. She was Charles Sterling's personal attorney, a woman who carried a leather briefcase like some people carry authority, with no need to announce it. Violet had called her from the 4th floor, and she'd come with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to rooms that had recently changed temperature. She opened the briefcase without ceremony and presented the contents of Charles Sterling's private office file, a USB drive, a sealed folder of printed communications, and a handwritten timeline Charles had compiled over the last 18 months of his life, tracking anomalies in the company's freight network he hadn't been able to fully explain before his health failed. Precise and grew shakier as the months progressed, the way a man's body fails before his mind does. Grace explained that Charles had instructed her to release the file only when the flowers were delivered, and only to Violet directly. He'd been specific in the way dying men are specific when they know their specificity is all they have left. "If the flowers go out, it means I am gone, and the danger I was tracking has arrived. Give my daughter everything." The USB drive contained emails. The emails contained numbers. The numbers matched what Marcus had identified in the billing records. The communications ran through a single account organized under one name, Daniel Foster. The room processed this. The room's process thing, and in retrospect, inevitable. Silence, then murmuring, when people realized they'd been standing in a burning building and mistaking the heat for sunlight. Margaret Ashby removed her glasses and set them on the table. She looked at the handwritten timeline, at the shaky letters near the end, and her expression shifted from professional attention to something more personal. The look of a woman who'd known Charles Sterling for 20 years and was only now understanding what his final months had looked like from the inside. She touched the edge of the last page with one finger, very lightly, as if it might break. Daniel Foster left the room before the session formally adjourned. He left with the controlled speed of someone who knows the door is still open but understands it won't be for long. He didn't look at Marcus as he passed. He looked straight ahead, and the straightness of his gaze was its own confession. 2 board members who'd been most aligned with his position followed him into the hallway. Voices rose briefly, then quieted. The remaining board members sat in silence. One man who'd nodded along with Daniel's presentation not 30 minutes before picked up the printed summary in front of him, looked at it, and set it down face first, as though he couldn't bear the numbers anymore. Another reached for the handwritten timeline and began reading from the beginning, slowly, the way you read something when you understand you're holding a record of a man's final effort to protect what he built. Margaret Ashby looked at Violet, then at Marcus. "Your father was thorough," she said to no one in particular. Violet looked at the crimson roses on the credenza along the wall. "Yes," she said quietly. "He always was." The bouquet sat among coffee cups and printed reports, and the debris of a meeting that had begun as a financial presentation and ended as an unraveling. The roses were very red against the pale wood, patient and undeniable, the way certain truths wait until the room is finally ready to see them. 3 hours later, Violet found Marcus in the lobby. The same lobby where she'd told security to remove him that morning. The same marble floor where the card had fallen. The same glass walls through which the same rain was still falling, softer now, as if the day itself had grown tired. Marcus stood near the door, looking at the rain through the glass. He didn't turn when Violet approached, because he heard her heels on the marble and chose to wait. She came to stand beside him. They both looked at the rain for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't have to. I do. And I want to give it properly." She turned to face him. Several staff members were in earshot. She didn't manage that. This was something she needed to say where it could be heard. "I judged you by everything that didn't matter. Your skin, your jacket. The fact that you came through that door looking like someone this building was designed to keep out. I made a fast, easy decision, and I was wrong." Marcus looked at her, his expression neither cold nor warmly forgiving. It was something steadier than either. "I accept that," he said, "but the apology you owe me is the smallest one on the list. The bigger debt is to the next black man in a wet jacket, who walks through that door with something real to say and gets shown to the street because he doesn't look expensive enough. Whatever you change here, start there." Violet was quiet. Something in what he'd said had landed where she wasn't prepared to defend. She didn't try. "I'd like to offer you something formal," she said. "Your personnel file will have the record corrected. The refusal report will be reinstated with proper context. I'd like to engage you as an independent operations consultant to review the full supply chain at a proper rate." "I appreciate that. You sound like you're going to say no." He looked at her, something almost careful in his gaze. "I'm going to say, not yet. I need time to think about whether I want to step back into this world, and what form that should take." He shifted his bag strap. "I need to get home. Mrs. Patterson has been watching my son all morning, and I told her I'd be back by noon." "How old is he?" Violet asked. 6. She nodded. Something crossed her face that wasn't pity. It was closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who understood what it meant to carry more weight than you were built for, and to carry it anyway because there was no one else. Robert Vance found Marcus near the door on his way out and stopped him. He wasn't in security mode now. He was a man standing in a lobby holding his hands in front of him. "I was out of line this morning," Robert said. "I had orders, and I followed them without thinking about the whole picture." Marcus paused. "My son is 6. He wasn't here today, but he watches everything. He watches how buildings like this treat his father. That lives somewhere in him. If you want to do something with the apology, think about that the next time someone comes in with the wrong shoes." Robert nodded slowly. They shook hands. Marcus walked out into the afternoon. That evening, alone in her office, Violet read the rest of her father's letter. She'd read the first portion that morning with Grace. The portion naming Daniel's fraud, tracing the buried reports, laying out what he'd suspected and confirmed. But there was a second part, written in a different pen, in handwriting that looked more labored, the way his handwriting had looked in the final months when holding a pen required the kind of effort that used to go into boardroom presentations. He wrote, "I have spent most of my life in rooms like the one you're sitting in now, and I want to tell you the only thing I learned worth knowing. The people who will protect this company aren't the ones who speak loudest. They're the people who say no when saying no costs them everything, and then go home and feed their children anyway. I met one of those people on a rainy road when I was frightened and alone, and he gave me his coat without knowing who I was. That is rarer than anything this company will ever produce." He wrote, "The crimson roses are not what you think they are. Your mother loved those roses before we lost each other. I sent them every year, not to make you forgive either of us, but to remind you that love doesn't stop being real because it becomes painful. You stopped receiving them because you couldn't see past the pain. I understand that. I only ask that you try." He wrote, "If Marcus Cole carried those roses to you, it means 2 things. The day I hoped would never come did come, the day the company was in real danger, and he is still, after all this time, the kind of man I believed he was. Trust that. You have not trusted enough of the right things." Violet set the letter down. She sat in her father's chair, and looked at the crimson roses, which Sarah had transferred to a vase on the windowsill before leaving. The city outside was darker and shinier, very still. She cried for a while. Not publicly. Just the quiet private grief that comes when you understand something you should have understood long ago, and can't decide whether it's better or worse that you finally understand it now. She held the letter against her chest and sat in the dark office while the city lights came on one by one outside the glass. Somewhere across town, Marcus sat at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table while Elijah ate a grilled cheese sandwich and described the cartoon he'd watched. The boy had his toy truck beside his plate and was happy in the uncomplicated way children are when they don't yet know how close the edges of things are. She wasn't evaluating his jacket or his shoes or anything superficial. She was studying the steadiness in his face, the way he held himself without apology or pleading, or any performance of humility or defiance. She saw a man who had walked into a building that didn't want him, and had stayed because he'd been asked to do a simple thing and intended to do it. Something in that steadiness unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was the exact quality she'd spent 14 months searching for in every advisor, consultant, and board member who sat across from her. And here it stood in her lobby in a wet jacket holding red roses. "Sarah," she said, "please take Mr. Cole somewhere he can wait comfortably, not the main lobby." She looked at Marcus. "I'd like to talk with you before you leave." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Sarah stepped forward and gestured toward the elevator. Marcus nodded once, gathered the roses more securely, and followed her. As he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the two receptionists on his back. He didn't turn around. He'd learned long ago that turning around only gave people what they wanted, confirmation that he knew where he stood. The small waiting area Sarah led him to was on the 4th floor. Good chairs, a side table with coffee and water, a view of the city in the rain. Sarah poured him a cup without asking, a small kindness that told Marcus she'd understood something about the morning that the people downstairs hadn't. He sat, held the coffee, and watched the rain stream down the glass. He thought about Elijah at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, probably on her couch with his toy truck, watching cartoons and causing no trouble at all. Violet arrived 20 minutes later. She sat across from Marcus and placed the folded note on the table between them. "Tell me about the night you met my father," she said. She wasn't evaluating his jacket or his shoes or anything superficial. She was studying the steadiness in his face, the way he held himself without apology or pleading, or any performance of humility or defiance. She saw a man who had walked into a building that didn't want him, and had stayed because he'd been asked to do a simple thing and intended to do it. Something in that steadiness unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it was the exact quality she'd spent 14 months searching for in every advisor, consultant, and board member who sat across from her. And here it stood in her lobby in a wet jacket holding red roses. "Sarah," she said, "please take Mr. Cole somewhere he can wait comfortably, not the main lobby." She looked at Marcus. "I'd like to talk with you before you leave." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Sarah stepped forward and gestured toward the elevator. Marcus nodded once, gathered the roses more securely, and followed her. As he walked away, he could feel the eyes of the two receptionists on his back. He didn't turn around. He'd learned long ago that turning around only gave people what they wanted, confirmation that he knew where he stood. The small waiting area Sarah led him to was on the 4th floor. Good chairs, a side table with coffee and water, a view of the city in the rain. Sarah poured him a cup without asking, a small kindness that told Marcus she'd understood something about the morning that the people downstairs hadn't. He sat, held the coffee, and watched the rain stream down the glass. He thought about Elijah at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, probably on her couch with his toy truck, watching cartoons and causing no trouble at all. Violet arrived 20 minutes later. She sat across from Marcus and placed the folded note on the table between them. "Tell me about the night you met my father," she said.